Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. You can applaud. This is a great room. I don't often get applause. My name is Marcia Eli. I am the Director of Programs here at the Center for Brooklyn History. On behalf of all of my colleagues at the Center and my colleagues at the Brooklyn Public Library, which we are part of, and the Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents, it's my honor to welcome you tonight to Children of the Movement Growing Up with Parents in the Black Panther Party, presented in partnership with The Guardian. For those who are in this space for the first time and wondering what goes on in here, I'll share that the Center for Brooklyn History is a museum, a world-renowned special collection, an education center serving students of all ages, and a place of community dialogue and conversation, largely through free weekly programs like this one. Our public programs regularly touch on the history of race and inequality. Tonight's program is just that. But there are further examples. For instance, next week, we present part 2 of a series titled Environmental Injustice, Race, Class, and Toxic Inequality. Later in June, we welcome 3 renowned experts on immigration, including historian Nancy Foner and former United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees and current Executive Dean of the New School for Social Research, Alex Alenikoff. So there's many more things coming down the pike. I hope that we'll see you all back here soon. Now let me share just a little bit about how tonight will go. We begin with a screening of the short film produced by The Guardian and based on their article titled, the film is titled, The Black Panther Cubs When the Revolution Doesn't Come. Following the film, we'll welcome an extraordinary panel of Panther Cubs for a moderated conversation, at the end of which there will be a chance for you to ask your questions. And our ushers will bring a mic to you at your seats. Please stand when you speak. This will help us, and try to keep your questions brief. Finally, after the program, we hope you'll stay to mingle and continue the conversation at a light reception in the Welcome Center, thanks to The Guardian. And I can't begin to really thank our partners at The Guardian for all that this has been. They inspired the entire program and gathered this special reunion of Panther Cubs. It's really been a joy to work together, and I hope that it's the first of many collaborations. Now, please help me welcome Betsy Reed, editor of The Guardian US, to say a few words.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Marcia, for providing this beautiful venue for this very special evening. As she said, I lead the U.S. operation of The Guardian, and you may know The Guardian as a British newspaper, but in fact, for more than a decade, we've had a real presence here in the U.S. As we talk about it, we cover America both for Americans and for a global audience, for the rest of the world. And we've grown from a small handful of expat reporters to 170 staff members across New York and the rest of the country. And we're really just so grateful that all of you have come out this evening to learn about this project, reporting on the legacy of the Black Panther Party, and in particular, the extraordinary life experiences of party members, now adult children, some of whom we have the honor and pleasure of hosting here tonight. My colleague Ed Pilkington's reporting on this fascinating subject comes at a time when trust in the media is eroding. This kind of project shows how The Guardian is able to go beyond the news of the day in Washington, as riveting and horrifying as that may be, to shed light on the real-world impact of systemic inequalities that have persisted since this country's founding. Ed's story is particularly resonant in this fraught moment we are in today, and I look forward to hearing from him and the panel about some of the insights from that period that are still painfully relevant. I'm incredibly proud to be able to share this project with all of you and encourage you to read Ed's full story on our website when you can. If you'll join me in turning your attention to the stage, we'll start tonight's conversation with a short Guardian documentary highlighting the experiences of 3 Black Panther cubs from Ed's reporting. Thank you.
I'm Lauren Williams. I'm a deputy editor at Guardian US. I'm responsible for our race and equity coverage, and I had the privilege of working with the brilliant Ed Pilkington and Jessica Reed on the piece of journalism that preceded this film. So I'm just going to introduce you all to our esteemed panelists, and then we'll get into the night. Ed Pilkington is chief reporter for Guardian in the U.S. He's been with the newsroom since 1993, covering issues spanning politics, criminal justice, race, immigration, poverty and inequality, and gun violence. So, not much. Ericka Abram, as you've seen her in the film, she's that little one right in the front, third from the left, is a curator of culture and a public speaker. A graduate of Spelman College, Ericka's developed... Spelman in the house. I always love when HBCUs are in the building. Ericka is developing projects for production, including an HBCU sitcom and a documentary about her great-grandfather, Emmett J. Scott, the first Black film producer in America. She is the daughter of the Black Panther Party chairman, Elaine Brown, and the party's Minister of Education, Messiah Hewitt. Kasise Sadiki is a performing artist. Producer and dedicated advocate for justice. She leads the international campaign to free political prisoner Kamal Sadiki, her father. And she also serves as senior policy associate at the New York Immigration Coalition, where she works to advance protections for immigrant communities across the state. Kasise is the daughter of the aforementioned Panther Kamal Sadiki and Panther Pamela Hanna. Sharif El-Mekki is the CEO and founder of the Center for Black Educational Development. He's a former educator, principal, and a U.S. Department of Education Principal Ambassador Fellow. Sharif is the son of Panthers Aisha El-Mekki and Hamid Khalid. So like I said before, the film was gripping, powerful, beautiful, but I just want to rewind a bit to the journalism that preceded it. So Ed, you spent a decade bringing this story of the Black Panther Cubs to life. Could you just talk to us about how it all came together?
Thank you for that. Unbelievably, it was more than a decade. A sort of the way I see it with myself is I've been on this journey that kind of tonight is the culmination of it. So I'm so happy that you're all here tonight to share this with us. It began, as Betsy said at the beginning, when The Guardian decided to become a sort of American player in the media market here. And we decided to see if we could bring our journalism to this country and whether we could contribute something. And I was there at the time. It was around 2012, 2013. We began by thinking, what kind of subjects could The Guardian's kind of singular voice, add to what was already here in the American media. And one of those subjects was the death penalty, which I was assigned to do, and I still report on it quite a lot. It doesn't take you long reporting on the death penalty to realize that death row is packed with African Americans, many of them put there by all-white juries, others through extraordinary kind of jaw-dropping prosecutorial misconduct, and just a stream of a breathtaking, sort of callous, improper prosecutions. So that was sort of the start of my journey. From there, I started reporting on solitary confinement. If you're on death row, you're almost always in solitary, and that's its own form of torture. And that brought me to the Angola Three, and to the particular Herman Wallace, Albert Woodfox. I started writing about them because they were the longest-standing solitary confinement prisoners in the country, 42 years in solitary and in total isolation, which for me was mind-blowing because you can go insane within a week if you're put in an isolation cell. And yet they were, and I spoke to Albert Woodfox quite often, he was extraordinarily together, thoughtful, inspiring. He was an extraordinary individual. So the question came up for me, why were they putting these guys in 42 years in solitary confinement? The answer was because they set up a cell of the Black Panther Party in their prison, Angola and Louisiana. And they set up a cell of the Black Panther Party because they wanted to desegregate the prison. This was the early 70s. Black prisoners were being put into chain gangs and taken out to the cotton fields to pick cotton for no money. And this was in a prison, Angola and Louisiana, which was converted from a cotton plantation. So to this day, there's no better example that I know of the endurance to this day of slavery within the prison system. So I started asking, how many other Black Panthers are there still in prison? And that was the next phase of my reporting. We did a big series of pieces. We found there were 19 of them, and we started reporting on them. And that took me to the MOVE organization in Philadelphia, a sort of cousin group that has similarities and differences from the Black Panthers, but in the 70s were very active in the Black liberation struggle as well. And it was when I was down in Philadelphia at a MOVE organization meeting, because MOVE still exists, unlike the Black Panther Party, and we were discussing reparations, I think, for the various atrocities that were done to the MOVE organization there. And I sat down next to a woman who introduced herself as a Panther Cub. And I said, what's a Panther Cub? And she said, well, I'm a daughter of a Black Panther. As it happens, her father was in prison for 49 years and 22 of those years in solitary confinement. So you can start to see how the bits of my reporting were starting to come together. I was amazed by this idea. Panther Cubs, never even heard of the concept. It was self-identified. They clubbed together. They actually came together, supported each other. And I vowed on the spot one day that I would write about the Panther Cubs. That was 4 years ago, and here we are tonight. The woman is Sharon Schultz, and she's here with us tonight. Sharon, please stand up. Thank you, Sharon, because if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have done any of this, and we wouldn't be here tonight. So thank you. And that's my journey, and that's why we're here. Thank you. Okay.
That's all. Ericka, you talked in the piece and in the film about attending Black Panther School in early childhood. And in the piece, you described your experience there saying, I never was hungry, I never felt scared, I never felt unloved. And as we know, when you were 8, you were relocated to Malibu. Your schoolmates became Lisa Marie Presley and Jodie Foster. So I'm just really curious about the dissonance that happens going from this school in Oakland where you felt surrounded by your peers, by love, and then moving to this private Malibu school. Like, what were the biggest differences from the Panther dorm to your new existence?
I mean, the biggest difference was I lived with my mother. So when we left Oakland, we lived together, and I grew up watching a lot of television, and I thought we would be like The Courtship of Eddie's Father, if you're old enough to know that show. But I wasn't prepared to live in America. So even at the lycée, which is where Lisa Marie Presley, Jodie, I mean, they're older than me, but that's where I, punched a couple of people, had fights. One of my teachers put me out of class for sitting quietly during the Pledge of Allegiance. I just wasn't equipped. So even if it had been Los Angeles and not Malibu or Beverly Hills, I probably would have had the same, fighting, suspension. That's why I got sent to Spelman, was to fix it.
I think it's that really struck me in the piece, the sort of duality of that life. A theme that came up was the constant preparation for prep. Because Sissa, you talk about, and we'll get to this, the constant, your parents being like, the revolution is going to come. And then when you were extracted from that world, Ericka, how unprepared you were for that. There's a section in the piece titled, Daddy, was the cause more important than your children? It's a question that Sharon actually asked rhetorically to Ed in her interview with him, referring to how she processed her childhood. And in that section, Ericka, you talk about your mom not being there when you learned to walk or when your teeth started to come in. And over the years, you asked yourself the same questions that Sharon did of her dad, of the Panther, Russell Schultz. So where have you landed on those questions about whether the revolution was more important than being a parent?
The greater good is always going to be more important. I mean, my shero, everyone knows, is Harriet Tubman. So the duality of trying to have a personal life and be a parent and a Panther, it's just, I mean, part of the reason that we lived in dormitories is because the people who raised us were Black Panthers. They were just the child care Panthers. And then there were the Panthers like my father who were the more equipment Panthers, and my mother, the more political aspect. And when I think about now, her building the Black Panther in Oakland is 80 units of affordable housing where people pay $300, and the floors were made and installed by Black manufacturers and the windows. So I don't know if all of the things that they lost, the funerals that my mother attended, were worth it. But when I look at the 80 families that are living in this building that have that opportunity, and of course my mother wants people to copy the Black Panther in Oakland, so part of me hopes that it was worth it, because it has to be when Fred talks about losing his father in such a violent way to the United States.
Thank you. Kasise, your section in the piece starts with this anecdote. Ed is telling the story of a little girl in a courthouse playing peekaboo with a woman who was on trial, sitting in the dock. And that child was Kasise, and the woman was Assata Shakur. This was also during a time that your dad was incarcerated. He was incarcerated up until you were 8 and released, and you had time together, which I want to talk about, and then incarcerated again in your 30s. So those bits for me highlighted how you have been aware of the carceral system since you were a child. 2 years old, I think, you were paying visits to your dad in prison. So how does that shape who you are as an adult?
Well, the stories that you mentioned, playing peekaboo with Assata Shakur, it's not something that I talk to everyone about. You know, I have close family, friends who know more about my personal life. That time that I played peekaboo with Assata, I remember it. I grew up, and we talk about duality, I grew up with a Panther mom who, of course, believed in liberation. And during the time, again, my father did go to prison in 1971 to 1979. I spent a lot of time in court. So I spent time playing peekaboo with Assata. And then my mom and my other aunt, Eni, another Black Panther warrior woman, would take another cub cousin and myself to the park or give us other opportunities, because they knew that taking their children to court all the time was a lot. And even the time when Assata was playing peekaboo with me, she was facing life. So that was her moment, and my mom shared with me, that was a moment where she could feel normal, where we locked eyes. And she's like, with everything that was happening in her life, she could stop for a moment and we could connect. And I'm 53 and I still remember that. And yes, I spent time I experienced my father be beat up. We talk about police brutality. In Assata's book, she mentions a little girl who had witnessed her father being beaten to death. Not to death, but beaten, brutally beaten. And I don't remember that, but it was very traumatic, you know. There was a point that my mother had to make a decision. As a woman, as a mother, she could not subject me to that, because it was very traumatizing. I also spent time when my father was in Sing Sing, or I would go upstate with my mom, and she would pack a lunch and try to make the experience as pleasant as possible. So she always was a storyteller, and she's like, we're gonna visit your father, and then we're gonna go to the lake. So, yes, duality, having trauma, but then having the backbone and the strength of warrior woman and being like Malkia's and that also there being a part of other cubs because we didn't have normal lives and we did experience prison and death, and so we had each other. So I've experienced seeing my father in prison. I've experienced going back and forth to prison since I was a little girl, born basically.
You had, I think, a really unique experience in that he was imprisoned until you were 8, but then you had 20 plus years with him.
Yes.
When he came home and he had a regular job, he was a regular dad, and then he was taken away from you again. So I'm just curious about, could you give us a window into those years with your dad? Like, what do you guys like? What is your relationship like? What were you able to gain with him in that time you had with him?
Yes, I'm so close to my father, and that's why I advocate for my father so much, because I was born and raised out of love. So when my father came home, he was 26 years old. The day he came home from prison, it was July 1979, and I was so excited. We had been writing letters to each other, and I was born in Queens, and my mother and Aunt Annie went to pick him up, and when he arrived, sharing the story, that was one of the best days of my life. And we were so excited, and we just had that moment, father-daughter, and we just walked up and down together and talked. And my father's really cool, like when I look at him, I just, he's a very interesting, just fun person. So we talked and everything, but one of the things about a lot of the Black Panther men in prison is that a lot of the Black Panthers were martial artists. And so when my father first came home from prison, I thought that we were gonna I went to dancing school and I thought we were just gonna have fun. And he was about discipline. And so he would wake me up on Saturday mornings and be like, "Kasise, it's time to work out," and I would be doing all kinds of things and jumping jacks and everything. And I was like, "Daddy, we're supposed to bond. This is not what I expected." But yeah, they did. They're warriors, they're soldiers. So he wanted to prepare me for that. And but he he has a daughter. So, but my father and I are so close. And that's why the work that I do and advocating for my father, it's all from love. I'm going to protect him, just like he protected me and my mom. So.
Many people don't know about the social services that the Panthers provided. You saw in the film free school breakfast, which was sort of a blueprint to free school programs or free lunch programs in America, medical treatment for uninsured patients, legal services, prison transport for families visiting incarcerated loved ones. But providing an alternative education for Black kids was a central tenet of the group's ethos. So the Panthers didn't have a dedicated school in Philly, where Sharif is from, but you went to a radical liberation school that similarly prioritized Black pride. So could you just talk to us a bit about your schooling and what your classes were like, what it was like being in a school like that?
Yeah, absolutely. It reminded me a lot about, some of those educators are still around, and speaking to them, they had a lot of similarities. If the Panthers, if people know, originally they were going to be called, Sons of Malcolm. So many of these would have been the daughters of Malcolm, is like how they viewed themselves, and education was a central part of that. Drawing from point number 5 on the on the 10-point platform around education and what that should mean, and how it can lead to liberation, but also informing. But they built an ecosystem, and not just the formalized school version, but also I learned how to read on my cousin's indoor porch. So not only my 2 parents in the Panthers, but my cousin Sharon Russell's here. they have we have an aunt, Dr. Suzette Hakim, who started a school for the community on her indoor porch. Basically saying, we're not waiting for the institution to teach our children how to read, we're gonna teach them how to read. And these are like 3 and 4-year-olds, right? But they were constantly centering education. But what made our school unique was very tied to a lot of the things that were discussed. It was about liberation. So our classrooms were named after African liberation groups. So you started in TANU, then you went to ZANU, then you went to PAIGC, then you went to Frelimo, then you went to MPLA, then you, 6th grade, you're SWAPO. So if you're not familiar with these are all armed resistance on the continent of Africa fighting against colonialism. So from early on, you're pre-K, you're learning about the international solidarity, about struggle, about white supremacy, about community, about love, about humanity. And so you're learning these kind of things, even just from the name of your class. Okay, why are we named after this? Who's the leader? Why, all of these kind of things. And so as we're learning that, it's also constantly tied to humanity and freedom. We had a Freedom Now choir. Our, similar martial arts, they were like, if you're gonna speak the truth, you gotta be able to defend the truth. So we didn't have gym, we had martial arts. And we had an African martial arts system. And we didn't just want to learn, they didn't just want us to be bilingual, they wanted us to learn Swahili. So we're learning Swahili and we're taking martial arts, and very different than a lot of our neighbors. It's just like, what are these radical, a group of kids, but for us, it was just, this was the natural state of being. And it was able to, I didn't go to traditional public school till 10th grade. And so and it wasn't until I became an educator I realized how much rage I had within me coming out of the system that I felt loved and protected and supported and informed to be, feel like in a sense of violence in a traditional public school. Not necessarily all physical violence, the intellectual and cultural violence. Where a teacher is reprimanding me in 10th grade because I'm like, there are more authors than what you keep shoving down our throats. The social studies teacher where I'm contradicting what she's teaching out of a textbook, mind you, but I'm just like, this is BS. What are you talking about? Let me tell you what, what actually was happening around the world. And I remember telling her, like, Europeans are actually our children, they've just forgotten. Like, the first people were from Africa, and I, almost got suspended for that. You know what I mean? Like the blasphemy of it all, right? Like, but all of those kind of, kind of things I think were informed us as children, as part of our educational system that we just looked at as natural.
That is fascinating, and it goes into a bit of my next question. As you're an educator now, how do you think the education that you received affected your growth and your development? And what differences do you see in kids today who are learning from like a traditional American system? Like, what are the gaps that you and your classmates didn't have because you had this sort of like holistic education that you're seeing or that you have seen in your students?
I mean, the gap is a chasm as wide as I can, I can imagine. I think the number one thing is centering humanity. My mother used to say that America hates children. And as a child, I'm like, no, you're not. Look at all this candy. Look at the TV shows. Like, what are you talking about, Mama? And I couldn't quite understand it. And she used to say something else that would annoy the mess out of me. She was like, if anybody's going to brainwash my children, it's going to be me. And I'd be like, I don't want to be brainwashed by nobody, But when I became an educator, and again, I'd only went 10th through 12th grade in the public system, so then returning as an adult and seeing, oh, our people are being brainwashed. Oh, our people aren't aware of this. Oh, this is like the official kind of brainwashing text and programming. And the opposite of that, the anti-humanity versus the humanity of that. And we see it, in the cyclical, right? Like the anti-truth campaign isn't new. So when we think about Carter G. Woodson, he was on a truth-telling campaign a long time ago. Later, Malcolm was on a truth-telling campaign a long time ago. And here we are yet today, a truth-telling campaign. And it's a campaign because there's such a level of resistance about truth. Right? And so we have to go overboard to really make sure that people understand that this is all part of the plan, you know. But you know, it reminds me too, like our children today aren't exposed to things like political education. I was in elementary school having a political education class. That's from the Panthers, you know. That's from Malcolm. That's from, you know, this long line of people trying to make sure their children are well educated and informed, you know. So when people were surprised about Trump, I was like, oh, I remember in 5th grade our teachers talking to us about Ronald Reagan. And us looking, I remember we had to do a presentation of why would, you know, the prompt was, why would Ronald Reagan announce his presidency in Philadelphia, Mississippi? That was the prompt. So remember, this was 79, 80. I was 8, 9 years old. And so our groups, we had to go research, and we didn't have internet. So we're in, like, you know, our trips were to the library, you know, to courts. You know, to visit Angela Davis when she was in town, you know, that like this kind of political education was happening. But we had to understand that he announces something like this, who is he talking to? You know, and the teacher was just asking questions. Who's he talking to when he's in Philadelphia, Mississippi? So we're like, oh, well, that's where the 3 civil rights murders were. Well, oh, he wasn't really talking to them. Oh, he's talking about states' rights. States' rights to do what? You know, so those are, you know, the things that we feel like are missing. But the central part of it is the humanity of Black people and the humanity period. And then how do you develop a positive racial identity of a child? How do you do that in the midst of anti-Blackness, in the midst of immigrants, right? Like, how do you still center humanity is, I think, a central part that's often missing in curricula.
I want to stick to your note about truth and bring it back to you, Ed. You interviewed, in terms of journalism, you interviewed 9 cubs across the country. Many interviews were 3+ hours long. This is such an emotional, sensitive topic. And for people to bravely come forward and share, you know, how their childhoods and lives were impacted, augmented, complicated by the Black Panther Party is such a feat of journalism. So as a reporter, how do you get people to open up to you and share in such a way, that, you know, especially being an outsider, right? Like we talk about, you know, The Guardian, right? Like as a British journalist, like how do you get people like Ericka and Kasise and Sharif to open up to you?
Should we shake hands again? Let's do it. Well, I've always been amazed as a journalist by how open and giving people can be in any story I do. But in this particular work of journalism, I was, you know, really amazed and incredibly grateful by what was given to me. I mean, I think you've had from the film and from what you've been hearing from the 3 here, you can see how kind of intimate the material is. As Kasise says, you know, I was asking you stuff that even really close friends, you hadn't ever told them, right? And you were sharing with me things which you hadn't told many people. And that I think was true of all 9 cubs who I talked to over a couple of years. And so I was aware from the very beginning that I was going into incredibly private and in some cases difficult territory about trauma, traumatic experiences, loss of parents, whether it's to prison or to the cause, in your case, Ericka. And but also complex ideas about that duality, as Fred Hampton Jr. puts it, you know, the blessing and the burden of being born into a revolutionary party. And, you know, ultimate outsider, I'm white, I'm male, I come from England, and I was asking about this extraordinarily important strain of history and politics in America. So how did I do it? How did we do it? Well, Sharon was critical from the very beginning, and she passed me on, and the next person passed me on, and that was very helpful. The fact that it took so long, it just took a really, really long time, I think was also a benefit, because I wasn't dashing in as reporters often do. I've done it plenty. You dash in and you kind of shake someone until they give you what you need, because you know you're filing in 2 hours' time and you haven't got any option. But in this case, we took it very, very slowly. It was very gentle. People could talk to me at their own pace when they were ready. I think that was important. And in the end, I think it was a leap of faith. I think you guys, you took a risk in talking to me, and you didn't know what I was going to do with it. I hope I shared with you the fact that we were serious about it. We weren't going to be sensationalist, and I think maybe you picked that up, and that was helpful. But it was a risk. You all took a risk, and at The Guardian we also took a risk, because this is not a top 10, 100 hit. It's a niche subject. It's a slice of history, but we thought, and I consistently thought, a really, really important one, with really important lessons for the current moment. And so we took a risk too. And I think the fact that so many people are here tonight, you're all here tonight, is our risk paid off. And I hope you all guys, you all agree with me.
Yeah, I just want to say too, it's like with the Cubs, again, we talk to Sharon, and we always talk amongst each other, like, do you think we can share this? And a lot of you don't know about the Cubs, and we have been on the front line. We have so many stories. We are the children of Black Panthers, of freedom fighters. And there's a legacy, and so we want our legacy to continue. And so I know for myself, I have grown up being paranoid because that's what we've experienced, and to not say certain things because you could not, because knowing that I do have a connection with Assata, there's just, but also knowing that this is part of my life, and I think stepping into who I am, and I've had to do that. So it's being vulnerable, but also being daring, because you do need to hear. The stories have to come from us directly. So that's why I took that chance.
Yeah, that's, I don't even think I talked about my experience as a Cub through high school, through college, not until I became an educator and really felt like, to really show up for these students, I need to, merge both worlds. Because I was separated. I'm like, all right, I'm doing, I'm playing football in high school and college, but over here, I'm not, never mentioned, I think maybe my roommates knew, but I can't even remember. But it was not a topic. But I think, it goes back to also community. And, I said, credible messenger. So my cousin, I remember when I first met Ed, Sharon brought you to my school. Then, I was hosting, he mentioned Move. I was hosting something for Move as a principal. And, they're like, where you come? Like, oh, you can have it here, And so that was community. Sharon, Teresa, Russell, my mother was there. And I remember she's like, oh, yeah, he might want to talk about the Cubs. And I'm like, I don't know. But I remember you talking to my mother. And I'm like, what'd you think about boy? You know what I mean? And she's like, no, he seems genuine. And to her, sincerity was a piece that, so between incredible messenger and mama's approval, which is all a part of it, but still, we can share some things from our, community with Ed.
I want to stay on that note about parents and how they've your relationships with your parents and how they've evolved as you've gotten older. Sharif, I was struck in the piece by the apology your dad gave you, not for the work itself, but for the consequences of the work. And you said you didn't need it. And alternately, Ericka, you said you never received an apology from your mother. Did that change?
Well, no. I mean, she was always sorry about, she was in North Korea when my teeth came in. But she also by the time I was 16, I was still going to visit Johnny Spain in prison. So there was a lot of things that kept us connected to those people. And I really didn't meet my father until I was about 9. He left the party in 74. So she worked hard to give me some sense of why. So it didn't feel as, she was in China when I started walking. But when we talked about visiting Johnny Spain, the first time I went to visit Johnny Spain in prison, he was on the yard, if you know his name, with George Jackson when George Jackson was assassinated at San Quentin. So I would go to San Quentin, but I thought it had a beautiful view, and I got to see Johnny, and I would say to him, next time I come, I'm going to bring a hammer and tap the glass and take you with me. And he would say, okay, thank you. But then when I saw him at 16, a few years before he was released from Vacaville, he said, you don't have any idea what it was like to have a child. And when you talked about Asada playing peekaboo, that I didn't really understand how terrible his situation was. And so he appreciated those. So when you talked about the programs, the prison visits were a lifeline for a lot of Black Panthers who were in prison.
Yeah. So how can y'all talk me through that sort of journey with your parents, that reconciliation, coming to understanding the consequences of their work? Because to say you're very close to your children, how has being a Panther Cub affected your parent, the way you parent? I'm just curious about the lessons that you guys have pulled through from your parental relationships.
With my children, and just like with my parents, protection is always very important. I have a story about, and I've shared this with some people, but for my children, I remember, so my dad was rearrested, and I hadn't seen him in a few years, and I took a road trip with my children and my mother to visit their grandfather, my father. And when my father is in Augusta State Medical Prison, so we took a road trip, so you know how long it takes to get to Augusta. My kids were excited to see their grandfather, but when we arrived at the prison, the guards, the police, they said that my children and my mother were not on the list, which is absurd. They were on the list. But that experience for them, was devastating because they really were excited to see their grandfather, and they were not allowed in the prison. And so I had to go in that prison by myself. And thinking about my mom, my mother has always been my protector. So I felt horrible that they couldn't go in. I felt scared because I had to go in by myself because my mom has always been the backbone. She's the one that would go into prisons. So that experience, them waiting, they had to wait outside. I went in, that actually changed my whole life in terms of really advocating for my father. But just seeing that pain that my children experienced, I don't want them to go through that. And I didn't want them to experience that. And unfortunately, when I think about this, my children were like 10, and my daughter, I think, was like 10. They haven't seen their grandfather since. And it's that like a choice. The fact that my father is so far away too, it's a lot. So I protect them, but they're still very close to their grandfather, and they're proud of their grandfather, and they write him letters. They unfortunately communicate through a system called JPay. So they have that kind of communication. But I realized that the way my mother tried to protect me, of course, at different times, is the same way I try to protect my kids, but also wanting to really be close, but knowing that prison is not where I want them to be. And just, again, the fact that they didn't even get a chance to go inside. So.
Yeah, he apologized because he was gone, a political prisoner for 17 and a half years. So I was a teacher when he was released. And so just that, but we would visit. My grandmother would take us up. We'd visit. His younger brother would take us up to visit. And it's interesting because I have 7 siblings, and we're on like a continuum of, the rage that some of them, I remember growing up and me wanting to smack some of I'm one of the oldest, so, wanted to smack some of the younger siblings because I felt like they were disrespectful to the sacrifices and the struggle. And it being like, little, back then we called them sissies, like, you little sissified, wimp, what I mean? Like, where's daddy? Where's daddy? Like, the people need daddy, people need our baba, and so there was like conflict even within us siblings, because I didn't feel that they were, like showing up for him and watching our parents back and the other Panthers back in the way that they should. As I've gotten older, I've had a lot more empathy. Like, wow, that was, being one of the older siblings, we were, all of them didn't go to our school either. Right, so the younger group did not go to our school. So they didn't grow up singing, "We are soldiers in the army. We got to fight, even though we got to die." Right? They didn't grow up with that kind of, orientation. They grew up like, "Where are my parents?" Which was a very different. But I think our relationship has improved. Talking about me and my siblings, based off of me developing more empathy for how they felt, and I remember my brother when one of the many times I wanted to smack him. He was like, "You sacrifice for the people. You sacrifice your family for the people," and I was like, "There's no dichotomy, with that." But later on, understanding like as a child, the pain that he was also, feeling, which I can't say I didn't have the pain, but also had an immense amount of pride. When I immense amount of, awe of the courage, like how young they were. My dad was 17 when he joined. When I think about what I was doing when I was 17, and then you talk about like, what are the children? When I think about 17 now, people talking about like, yeah, I'm a YN, and they talk about like where, YN versus I'm feeding the people. Like it's such a gap. Right, but part of that is our fault as well, because we're the generation in between, and we have to do a better job of educating and making sure folks are, the next generation is informed. Part of that tradition is train your replacements. So they may have trained us. I don't know if we've trained the next group.
I want to ask, thank you for that. I want to ask one more question before we open it to questions. In the film, Malkia said something that really resonated with me. They said, things are a mess right now, but when things are a mess, there's also a chance that anything can happen, not just anything bad, anything good. And Ed and I were talking a few weeks back about how struck we were at the sheer optimism of Panther Cubs, given everything y'all went through, given everything your parents went through. And so I'm just curious if everyone could just talk about where you think we are today, where the movements of today have gotten us, where Black Lives Matter, the Free Palestine movement, the immigration movement right now, because to say you're doing this work. What can people engrossed in these battles for social justice learn from the Panthers and the Panther Cubs?
Well, I can tell you that maybe years ago when George Floyd was murdered, someone asked my mother a question about what would the Panthers have done in this moment. And people ask her often, like, what should we be doing now? And then they don't like the answer because you have to be willing to die. So that's the first, if you're willing to die, then you're going to be able to accept the rest of the answer. So when they asked her about George Floyd, and she said, if there were 6 Panthers and we came upon this scene, obviously technology not being a thing to videotape it anyway, but she said, we would have to look among us and say, all right, well, one of us is probably going to get shot, but we're about to rush this pig. And people in the audience were like, oh, I wish she hadn't answered. Like, don't ask the question if you're not, but then you can pick and choose what you do in terms of being an educator, in terms of being an advocate, or, I work with my mother's a nonprofit, Oakland in the World, and to me, I tell her this all the time, she's the last Panther. This building, the Black Panther, is affordable housing, 80 units. The floors and windows were installed by Black manufacturers. So I look at that as an example, and she's hoping that other people will copy it. And she is working with the Black Lives Matter Foundation. We're part of the donors. So there isn't probably another opportunity for a Black Panther Party. just because of the sheer violence that the government, unleashed. My mother was going to 2 funerals a month for a couple of years. But then you find what you can do right now, what she's doing, what he's doing, and me working for my mother in Oakland on the world. But in terms of, when people talk about the Black Panther Party wanting to overthrow the government, and my mom was like, did we have a fucking jet? Like, we don't have a tank. It's not that this isn't. So what's possible is what is it that you're willing to do now?
Did anyone else want to?
Well, when we talk about optimism, my father is up for parole in July. And that's something that I could never envision for my dad. And so optimism is that resilience, that fight, the continuation to never not give up through everything, to keep pushing forward. There's a strength in me that I have that I'm very thankful for. And so when my father went to prison, back to prison, I felt like death. I lost myself. And now the work that I do, because I work at the New York Immigration Coalition, I learned, and it's challenging, and I have my colleagues here too, but I joined policy, and I'm an artist, and so I never thought that I would really understand legislation, put myself in a position where I really understood power, and knowing how to be strategic and really meeting with legislators and having direct communication with legislators on what the ask is. And so I know that the work that I'm doing now, I have a campaign for my father now too, and the work that I've learned and standing in just now there's a different kind of awareness. I am not a victim. And I think that's important to know. It's like, even the work that I do now, a lot of our members don't know, or we teach them about knowing your rights, and people have to be educated to feel their power and their worth. And so I've experienced being at a low point, but I rise, And so we have to understand and know what our position is, and we have to fight, but not just fight. There's different strategies and ways of getting power. And so I feel so good that I'm in a position now where everything that I learn and I'm learning, that I push for my father, and I'm claiming that my father is coming home. He's coming home. So
I think we'll open it up to questions on that note. There are folks who have microphones, so you can just raise your hand and someone will.
And while they're doing that, I'll just mention, at the core of it, I think Panthers were educators and organizers. And so, my colleague, Dr. Orpheus Williams, is here, and we've chosen a path of educating, and developing the next generation of Black educators, inviting youth to lead classrooms in schools and start schools or whatever, but education being central, because I think that's an important part of connecting the dots. That's the one thing I felt like I was well educated. So when people were talking about mass incarceration, a few years ago, we were like, wait a minute, mass incarceration started a long time ago. When I see, pictures of my father and colleagues where Rizzo would make them strip and they're, and they're boxers, I'm young saying oh yeah, I'm gonna be like that when I grow up. I'm gonna be in boxers, I'm gonna have an afro, and I might be arrested, right? Because they were educating people, and so helping connect the dots between what happened, what is happening, what's the future, And I think about Malcolm saying, the problem with the movement sometimes is organizing a sleeping people. You got to wake them up, then you'll get action, right? And I think that's what the Panthers took to heart, and that's the work that we have to continue.
You have a question?
Yes, I'd like to thank the I'd like to thank The Guardian for the work that you guys are doing. And my question is to The Guardian is, what's next? You know, for the Cubs and this line of work. And the reason why I ask that is because you talk about not knowing how the Cubs were going to react and things like that. What you may not know as The Guardian as that certain people look at all of the ragtag media that is, and if you guys are doing certain things, then people are going to lean into that. And so I'm leaning in asking, you know, oh, this is all great. I see all of this great. What is there more coming? Because you guys do a great job, and I just want to know if there's not, we got ideas.
Always looking for more ideas. I would say as the deputy editor of Race and Equity, this is what my desk does all the time. I think one of my mandates for myself when I got to The Guardian was to expand what the idea of a race story is. There's Black joy, there's Black culture. I want to know what we're doing in our communities, what we're doing when there isn't a gaze, what we're doing amongst ourselves. And so that is the core of Guardian journalism. We are a very progressive organization. Our readers are also very progressively minded as well. So we're constantly keeping that in mind, you know, holding power to account. Those are like the core values of The Guardian, but we have a desk dedicated to this work. I oversee 3 amazing Black journalists who are hungry and curious, and they love people of color. They're really interested in human interest stories, stories about how we got here. I love the idea that there is nothing new under the sun. Everything that is happening today is because something happened yesterday. So I would say that's a part of who we are. That is exactly what The Guardian is, and I think certainly our work feels even more important in this moment. We hear from our readers all the time that they don't feel like there are any other media organizations that they can turn to, and that feels like something that constantly keeps us going. Ed, what do you think?
I would just add that I think one of the great things to come out of this project with the Cubs, you know, one of the things we were determined to do when we did the project was to make sure it wasn't a piece of sort of static history, that it was current burning politics and not set in aspic. And that feeling came through, particularly when the orange-faced one, whose name I try and avoid, got back in the White House. There was a sense that, and we talked about that, you know, surprising optimism coming from the 9 Cubs who I was talking to, because it wasn't as sort of shocking. It had happened before, and there were strategies for how to cope with it. And I think what that taught us at The Guardian, or underlined for us, because we've sort of been practicing it as much as we can anyway, it underlined that if you find different voices, you can find different solutions. You know, orange face one happens, then you get the sort of democratic leadership giving sort of bland responses, which disappoint us all. But there are other people out there doing other things, thinking other things, different strategies, and our job is to find those people, find those voices, and give them an airing. And, you know, and that's the challenge. So we're very open to ideas about who the next people should be that we should be talking to, but that's what we're trying to do all the time, is find and then give a voice to people who are not getting heard when they have something to say.
Hello. Sorry.
Thank you so much. This was really powerful, and I feel very impacted. So just to preface what I'm going to say, I feel like this was so powerful because I think a lot of descendants of the transatlantic slave trade that are here in the US have navigated to fight for real education while also often being shamed for not being perfectly educated, and what you all are uplifting about your experiences going from one environment of love to another environment of exclusion and indoctrination. So the question I have is, as something of the runt of the litter, which I see myself as wanting to always find that nurture. In December, the United Nations declared the second international decade for people of African descent. And so my question, as somebody who's been learning more about organizing, but other mechanisms that integrate our story here and the larger world we're in, I'd like to ask for any insight you have or any interest in those sort of permanent forum of people of African descent that are folks like you and organizers and academia getting together and constantly pouring energy in to continue organizing. Oftentimes these are not things that I was exposed to as a young person, and I'm very excited. It's given me like a little bit of a heartbeat again and a little bit of hope and direction. So I'd really love to hear any insight you might have of interest of that or anything like that.
Yeah, I think there's always space for that. I went to one of the sessions at the UN, a couple, maybe a year or 2 years ago. So I think there's a lot going on. I think a big part of the work is connecting the dots because, sometimes it's in silos. So because he says working in immigration and, she was sharing more of her work. I was thinking about, I'm like, well, I wonder if that group who's doing immigration work has connected with her organization and what can they learn from what they're doing in New York. They could do that in other states, right? So I do think that, a big part is making sure that we're not too distracted and we're not too, focus isn't the right word, but with blinders on as we're doing the work, because one of our teachers used to say there's a constellation of the stars, and it's also that same type of constellation of human beings right here on Earth, but we usually can't see the stars because of the night pollution or the light pollution, and we can't see the connectivity here on Earth in this constellation of people doing similar work because of the distractions. So either way, the light pollution or the distractions here, they're there. So happy to talk afterwards. To get more specifics.
I think we have time for one more question in the back.
Thank you all very much for everything that you shared. So most children spend time in school and they spend time with teachers. And I would argue that children who are blessed get to spend time with Black teachers. And I'm wondering if you all have a message or anything that you'd like to share that you think is important for Black teachers in 2025 to know and or to do.
We need to continue teaching our history, and even maybe have, if you have special, speakers. I just spoke recently at Hostos, and there are so many students that really don't know, they have ideas of who the Black Panthers were, but they don't have these personal stories. The programming, the way that people see Black Panthers are just about picking up the gun, and they don't know about breakfast programs. They just don't have insight. So I think just the way we learn, because I went to liberation schools too, we just have to deprogram. We have to just have a different curriculums and programs, and even if it's outside of schools, have groups and just meet and talk and educate and have people like ourselves who really understand and have insight on what really happened to continue our legacy. So.
And I would, Misha's my colleague, so she's heard me say this, but I do, for the audience, in Iran, they used to say, tell the wall so that the door can hear you. So you are the doors, so we're just talking to the room. But I think two things. One, I think it's really important that Black educators, any educator that's worth their salt, but particularly, you asked about Black educators, they have to understand their role in the movement. Like they're not part of the system, even if they're in the system. So, at some point, I do think that we need more independent Black schools. But in the meantime, we should be able to flood the system with conscious, human-centered educators, right? Because we can't do independent schools tomorrow. So what the Monday morning question is, what's the mindset and the skill and the will of the educators that are leading classrooms, right? And if they can picture themselves as not even picture, in action, be vanguards, understand what the system and how many youth are being crushed. Where they're Carter G. Woodson said there would be no lynching if it weren't for the schoolhouse. There would be no lynching if it weren't for the schoolhouse. This was in the early 1900s, but I fast forward today, what type of lynching do our students experience? Cultural, emotional, spiritual, intellectual. So if that's what's happening, there are 8 million Black children, 11 million, students of color. How many in poverty? How many people with, with special needs? All the things. If they're being crushed, what is my role as the leader of that classroom and that school? That's what they have to come to grips with, and that's how they have to act upon every single day.
With that, will you join me in thanking Ericka, Kasise, Sharif, and Ed? Thank you.